Hey everyone. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Leyla Isik as today's MindCORE seminar speaker. Dr. Ishik has received training from some of the most influential figures in cognitive and computational neuroscience. So she received her PhD in computational biology at MIT, working with Tommy Poggio, where she developed models of invariant object and action recognition. After completing her doctorate, she traveled all the way to MIT and HMS, Harvard Med School, working with Nancy Kamwisher and Gabrielle Kryman jointly, where she developed techniques to study neural correlates of social interaction perception using intracranial recordings and neuroimaging. Leyla then joined Johns Hopkins University. Oh. Do we like wait that out or kind of like press a don't, ignore button or something?
Outside, no, there's no.
Nothing. Okay. Cool. All right. All right. So Leyla joined after her postdoc. She joined Johns Hopkins University, where she currently serves as the Claire Booth Luce Assistant Professor of Cognitive Science. She also has secondary appointments in the Biomedical Engineering and the Kavli Neuroscience Discovery Institute. Leyla's research program sits at the intersection of cognitive neuroscience and machine learning, focusing on understanding human action and social interaction by investigating how humans rapidly extract rich social information with remarkable ease. Not a trivial task, yet our brains are well optimized for this. Central to Leyla's approach is using large-scale naturalistic data sets to study social vision. Her lab has revealed hierarchical representations of social actions throughout the visual system, how relational visual information drives human social interaction recognition. One aspect of this work I find particularly compelling and impressive is her work showing that a lot of the current AI models, particularly the AI vision models, really fall short of matching human behavior and even the underlying neural representations that are supporting our rich social behaviors. In recognition of her impactful contributions, Leyla has received numerous prestigious awards. That includes recently the Vision Sciences Society Young Investigator Award and a Google AI Faculty Research Award. So today, Dr. Isik will discuss the neural computations underlying human social interaction recognition, presenting work on particularly human AI alignment. So please join me in welcoming Leyla.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that generous introduction, and thank you all for having me. Today I'm going to talk to you about seeing social interactions. So this is a video of my son Rami and his friend Sylvia. And before I press play, you can already recognize all sorts of things, right? So you can tell that there are two kids, they're outside, they have baskets. Maybe you notice Rami's sunglasses. But when I press play, an even richer story unfolds. So even though the video has no sound, you can tell that the kids are communicating with you. You can tell they have a goal to open up that egg, and they're helping each other with that goal. You can also make inferences about their motivations, like they really wanted to get in there, and even their mental states. And you do all of this just by watching their actions and interactions with each other in the physical world. Now, over the last several decades, we've made amazing progress in this first set of problems in scene and object recognition. And so generally, this is considered kind of the core of high-level vision. So not to say that these problems are solved by any means, but we have a pretty good idea of the neural substrates that support them, as well as a range of computational models that can solve these tasks in more or less human-like ways. And generally, everything else, all these other kind of more social traits I've talked about, have been considered to be part of higher-level social cognition involving theory of mind. But today I'm going to argue that we should be considering a richer definition of vision, including many of these tasks in the middle that we call social vision. and tell you about the work our lab has been doing to understand how humans recognize this information. And in particular, a major focus of our research has been in recognizing social interactions, how we recognize other people's social interactions, like the one between Rami and Sylvia in that video. You can do this not only in natural videos, but also from very stripped down visual displays. Right, so even though this video just has a circle and square moving around, you can tell that similarly, this square is trying to help this circle. And tell apart that from this scenario where the square is trying to hinder the circle. These abilities are shared with infants and primates. And although there's been some question about the replication of these abilities in the youngest infants, the story is sort of ongoing, I think there's no doubt that certainly older children and adults can very easily recognize this information, even from very simple minimal visual cues. And so the central question we try to understand in our lab is, how do we as humans solve this task? And in service of this, how can we get computational models that can do the same thing? And so I want to impress on you that this is a really hard problem, right? So unlike scene and object recognition, we don't have the same wealth of models that are trained to solve these tasks. And I'll show you in a little bit how models that we do have tend to struggle with them quite a bit. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? So even though you can do this effortlessly, across these two very different visual scenarios, you could categorize these both as social interactions of helping. So how do we do this? So today's talk, I'm going to tell you about kind of two broad lines of research in the lab. The first, trying to understand how we solve this in the human brain, in the human visual system. And the second, trying to evaluate both how current computational vision models do this, and how we can develop models that use more human-like inductive biases to solve the task in a way that's even better. Okay. So in a recent TICS review co-written with a former student in my lab, Emily McMahon, we reviewed growing evidence that there are several aspects of social interactions that seem to be prioritized by the human visual system. So these include both what we called sort of social primitive features, visuospatial cues that are often clues to interactions, but are not necessarily an interaction themselves. So whether two people are nearby each other, whether they're facing one another, and whether they're moving with contingent motion. But even further than this, we argued that there's growing evidence that there are several aspects of interactions themselves that seem to be recognized or prioritized in the visual system. For example, whether people are engaged in a physical interaction like dancing or fighting, whether they're communicating with each other, and possibly even higher level information like whether they're acting in a goal compatible way, like that helping versus hindering distinction I showed you. So there's now a growing amount of behavioral evidence, much of it led by Luba Papeo and her lab, suggesting that humans have visual templates to recognize not just single bodies or faces, but configurations of bodies in interacting postures. So in a visual search task, you're much faster at recognizing this pair of dyads that are facing each other in an interactive manner than the ones that are not facing each other. Interestingly, many of these effects disappear if you invert the stimuli, suggesting that for other classical effects in face recognition, we have visual templates for these pairs of bodies or faces. Her lab has also shown that there are regions of visual cortex, in particular the extrastriate body area, which is classically defined as being more responsive to bodies than any other visual feature, that also has a preference for facing over non-facing bodies. Sorry. So these behavioral visual effects also extend to dynamic stimuli. So in dynamic point light displays like these, you have better detection thresholds for each of the agents if they're paired in a communicative interaction than if they're doing independent actions. And in my postdoc with Nancy Canwisher, we showed people stimuli like these, and found that there was regions of the superior temporal sulcus, or STS, that are more selectively engaged when watching the point light figures interact compared to matched stimuli that are engaged in independent actions. This region responded not only to these point light figures, but also to these sort of animated geometric shapes when they were engaged in a social interaction above and beyond a single shape or pairs of physical objects interacting with each other. And importantly, we could identify this region in individual subjects. I'm showing you one subject's data here with the social interaction preferring voxels colored in red, which are both functionally and anatomically distinct from other nearby regions doing different visual, social tasks, like theory of mind. A core area of the theory of mind network is shown in blue, regions that respond to moving faces in yellow, and more generic motion in green. And in one of the first studies from our lab, a former postdoc, Hémy Lee Masson, showed that this distinction between social interaction and theory of mind in the brain exists not only for controlled tasks and stimuli, but also if people are watching natural movies or cinematic movies where these things co-occur all the time. And so what she did was she took fMRI movie data of people watching the television show Sherlock and labeled it with, which has many differences from those controlled stimuli, right? So there's not only a social interaction, but here you also see faces and hear voices. You think about their mental states and are parsing their language. And what Hémy showed is that by densely labeling all of these features, she could identify the unique variants attributable to, she did this with a combination of human annotations and automatic methods to find faces, key points, deep neural network embeddings of the frames. And when you do that, you can find the unique variants explained by social interactions above and beyond all of those other features. And she found very similar portions of the STS that responded to the social interactions in the movies, as we found in these more controlled point light stimuli. Suggesting that this distinction between social interaction and theory of mind, faces, et cetera, exists also in more real-world settings. And so these neural results have contributed to the idea that in addition to the classic ventral and dorsal streams, we have a third visual pathway, and primates in general have a third visual pathway along the lateral surface of the brain that's tuned for recognizing dynamic social information. And so in one of the initial reviews by David Pitcher and Leslie Ungerleider, they suggested that this pathway projected hierarchically from early visual cortex through motion selective region MT into the extrastriate body area and these STS regions that I've been telling you about. And again, they argued that this was a hierarchical visual pathway where information from one region fed into the next. And so like in the ventral stream, for example, where information at each subsequent area gets more and more complex, they argued that maybe something similar is happening in the lateral pathway as well. However, the specifics of the hierarchical computations and feature tuning had never really been comprehensively tested in individual subjects. So in an empirical study, again led by Emily in collaboration with Mick Bonner, we set out to ask whether the features of social scenes are computed hierarchically along this pathway. And so to comprehensively test this really wide swath of cortex, Emily curated a data set of 3-second video clips of 2 people engaged in everyday actions. She subsampled this from a popular computer vision data set and selected videos with only 2 people to try to minimize confounds based on the number of agents in a scene. And so in the end, she collected about 250 videos of 2 people that we played to people in the fMRI scanner without sound. We conducted a dense scanning experiment where people viewed these videos a lot of times, along with localizers to identify the regions of interest that have been proposed to be part of the lateral pathway. We also annotated the videos with different visual and social features, again, both by automatic methods like the early layer of a popular convolutional neural network AlexNet, the motion energy in each video, and then we had human annotators online rate information about the scenes and objects, those social primitive features, in particular, whether people were nearby each other or facing one another, the social interactions themselves, both whether people were engaged in a physical interaction or a communicative interaction, and then affective features, valence, and arousal. we got highly reliable data in individual subjects, in particular along these regions of the STS that have been hard to capture in other large-scale visual neuroscience data sets with static images. So this is the natural scenes data set, which is, I think, probably the largest visual fMRI neuroscience data set. It's many orders of magnitude larger than ours, and it's amazing for so many things. But because it only samples static scenes, you really don't get reliable responses along the STS. And so to understand what was driving these neural responses, we used an encoding model framework where we took each of the videos in the data set and all of the annotated features for motion energy, social interactions, et cetera, and learned the linear mapping between each voxel's response and the different features on a training set. Then in a held out test set, we can see how well the features, the learned beta weights on those features predict neural responses. And so when we do that, the encoding model works quite well. So this is the encoding performance in that same subject. And we can also look at it in the different regions of interest, going from early to more anterior in the lateral stream. And so in early visual cortex, the gray bars show the split half reliability range across subjects. And you can see that we have significant encoding performance approaching this value. This was true in all of our main regions of interest as well. But what we really wanted to understand was what features were driving information across the brain. And so to understand this, we used a variance partitioning approach, where if I just showed you the explained variance by all of the features in our model, in natural stimuli, these co-occur with each other, right? So the amount of motion correlates with the type of interaction, as do the social primitive features. So to understand the unique contribution of one group of features, what we can do is build an encoding model with all the features minus that feature of interest and take their difference. And so when we do that, what we see in these early regions is that the features that explain the most unique variance are in low-level regions, early visual cortex and MT are motion information, as you would expect. In these mid-level regions, we see information, particularly in LOC, about the both about the scenes and objects, but also about the social primitives, whether people are nearby or facing. We didn't find that in EBA as they had in prior work, but I think there are various reasons for that that I'm happy to discuss later. But I think really strikingly, when you look in these regions of the STS, the only group of features that explains unique variance are the presence of social interactions. And so as you go from more low-level to mid-level to high-level regions, you see that the information represented gets more and more abstract, which is one signature of things being extracted hierarchically. You can see this at the voxel level as well. So in that same subject, I'm coloring each voxel by its preferred feature, the feature that explains the most unique variance. And you see that you go from sort of these grays and blues in early visual regions to more purples and yellows. And then really strikingly, all along the STS, it's social interactions in almost every single voxel that explains the most unique variance. In a follow-up study, Emily showed these same videos to participants in the EEG, a different set of participants. And she developed new methods to use the same encoding model framework to relate people's time-resolved EEG activity to the fMRI responses, as well as the features. And what she can find then is she can actually track the time course of information across these regions. And what she finds is that this information is extracted similarly along a temporal hierarchy, where early visual information is first available in early regions, followed by followed by the social primitives, and then finally social interaction information in the STS. So all of those analyses I told you about so far consider these features as groups of features. All of the social interaction features include both physical and communicative interactions. We wanted to see if any of the individual features explained unique variance above and beyond all of the other features, which is a very stringent test because these all co-occur with each other, right? So whether people are facing each other and whether they're close by tend to co-occur in natural videos. And so when we do that, we get only two features that explain unique variance in a significant manner across subjects. The first is whether an action is directed at an object. And we see information particularly in these left lateralized regions of the occipital temporal cortex, which is kind of nicely confirmatory of prior work from Moritz Wurm and Alfonso Karamazza in very controlled stimuli. But I think really strikingly, the other thing we see is unique variance, significant unique variance explained by whether or not two people are communicating. And here we see really this is being shown bilaterally in these more anterior STS regions. And so this suggests that above and beyond all of these other features we labeled, the feature that these STS regions are most responsive to are whether or not two people are communicating. And I just want to mention again that these videos were shown without sound. And so it's not actually the presence of speech itself. We also don't think it's the presence of implied speech, which I'm happy to talk about why we think that follow-up analyses we did later. I think it's really something more gestural and postural about whether or not people are communicating that seems to drive unique variance in these regions. I'm also happy to be interrupted. Sorry, I should have said that earlier. But if there are any questions, please let me. Yeah, Johannes. Yeah.
How do you go about what value of those features are if they're non-binary?
Great. Great. So for some of them are automatically extracted, like motion energy, just we put it into motion energy model. The other ones are all human labeled on a 5-point Likert scale by at least 10 people. And so people don't agree perfectly on whether two people are communicating or not, but their correlation value with each other is above 0.8. And it's very similar for whether or not they're communicating as whether it's a faraway scene or nearby scene. So we take the mean or median, one of those two responses across all of our raters. And people seem to be pretty internally consistent with one another. Good question. Other question? Okay. So I think there's increasing evidence to suggest that pretty high level aspects of social interactions are extracted by something that looks a lot like a visual pathway. And if that is the case, a follow-up question we wanted to ask is, can this be, or how well is this recapitulated in hierarchical vision models, which seem to do so well at reproducing so many other aspects of human vision? So over the last decade or so, there's really been this amazing boom of research comparing deep neural networks to the brain. And one of the main things it revealed is that deep neural networks that seem to share a similar convolutional hierarchical structure to the ventral stream, when they're trained on an engineering task, like to recognize different scenes, their learned representations correlate very well with different parts of the primate ventral stream. Even to the point where we have kind of this nice layer-wise correspondence where early deep neural network layers map onto early visual cortex and later layers more anterior parts of the ventral stream. And so this was, I think, really exciting and nice in large part because these convolutional neural networks were built in large part based on inspiration from visual cortex. But in the last few years, I think this has gotten a little weirder. So it's not just convolutional neural networks that do this, it's also all sorts of vision models, like right now vision transformer models that I think, although I think you can kind of make a just so story about why lots of things look like the brain, but I think at a first glance seem much more removed from biology. So they take what are known as image patch, they patch up the image into different XY patches, get embeddings for those patches, and then learn this attentional weighting between the different input image patches. Even though they look so different from a CNN, their learned representations seem to match brain responses as well or better than CNNs. And so several people have shown this now. I'm going to highlight the work from a former postdoc in the lab, Colin Conwell, who first found that across a range of vision models, almost no matter how they were trained, almost no matter their architecture, you can get really good predictivity of ventral stream responses to, so this is human a pretty large swath of human occipital temporal cortex, but it works similarly across the ventral stream. You get a good match to responses to static images. So I think surprisingly at a first glance, what he and others found is that if you take not just those very different looking vision models, but also large language models that you evaluate by passing them a sentence caption of the image that people saw. So people saw these static scenes. You get a sentence caption of the scene, like an aerial view of rooftops and trees. You pass that through a language model. And it also predicts high-level ventral stream responses just as well as vision models. And so this is really kind of, it's very exciting and interesting, and in some ways I think has reignited debates about the extent to which human vision is aligned to or shaped by language. But in a collaboration with Marge Livingstone and her group, we showed these same images to macaque monkeys. And what we found is that the language models also predict pretty significant amount of responses in macaque IT as well, suggesting that whatever is driving their response, it can't be due to language per se. And so this is a bit of an aside, but I think it's an interesting way to look at the different, it illustrates nicely how we can look at the different computational pressures that shape different models and use this to try to understand how they match the brain and what that might tell us about the brain. It's also a bit of a cautionary tale, though, because I think, some of these, there's so many things that change between any two DNNs, you need to be careful about this comparison. But what we really wanted to get at was not just the ventral stream responses to static images, but what if instead of scenes like this, we show people short video clips like the one I just showed you? Do we still have the same wealth and diversity of computational models that match brain responses to these videos too? And so that's what a team of students in my lab led by Kathy Garcia with Emily McMahon and Colin Conwell set out to ask. And so they took that same fMRI data I just told you about, as well as the behavior annotations for each of those features of interest. And they used the same encoding model framework to try to predict either voxel-wise responses or behavior responses, not based on a set of human annotated labels, but based on a set of model features, layer-wise model features. So just like people have done in the ventral stream, you can take the same videos and pass them through different deep neural network models and ask if any of the layers match the different regions of the human brain or can predict human behavior responses. By learning the same encoding model and on held out data evaluating that model's prediction. They led this really heroic effort to gather over 350 different models that included image models, video models, and language models that they evaluated by getting sentence captions for the videos too. One disclaimer I have to add, because this research changes so quickly, is that this work was done about a year ago, so I'm happy to talk about more modern video models, but this is all circa 2024. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about it, but I don't think this is a solved problem yet, even by the better, more modern video models. Okay, so these are the same regions of interest along the lateral stream I showed you in the first part of the talk, organized from early visual cortex to more anterior regions. The gray bars are the split half reliability of each subject's data. And I'm going to show you the results for each of the 350 models. In a cross-validated way, we pick the best layer for each model and the best hyperparameters for that model to give it the best shot of matching the human data. So each dot is a model. So the most models we had, because they're the most prevalent type of computer vision model, were these image models. And then the horizontal bar shows you the average of that model class. I'm showing you here the models divided by modality, but we looked at lots of other features like the training set, the architecture that none of them really made a difference. So, but if you have a specific question, I'm happy to talk about that comparison too. Okay, so in early visual cortex, what we see is that image models do an okay job. Video models do about the same. Oop, My animations are not cooperating. Okay, but language models do much worse. This is actually what they find in the static scene responses as well. I was showing you high-level ventral stream responses, which do seem to align with language models, but early visual cortex responses don't, which is reassuring. But as we look at the more mid-level regions, what we find is that the average image model performance drops quite a bit relative to the noise ceiling. The language model performance goes up modestly. But here, I think really strikingly, the video models, sorry, my animations are not cooperating. Okay, the video models do a significantly better job than either image or language models. In some ways, this might not be surprising. We know that these regions are much more, these are videos that the participants were shown. We know that many of these regions are very sensitive to the dynamics of the input. But from an AI perspective, this was kind of surprising. These video models were relatively old compared to the image and language models. So the image and language models really are more of the latest and greatest, whereas the video models are much worse from a computer vision standpoint. But nevertheless, they do a much better job of matching these mid-level regions, which you can see in the whole brain responses as well. But now if we look at these regions in the STS, which are the ones that seem to respond preferentially to social interactions and communication, see that none of the models do a good job. The video models no longer are really showing this good performance. And this is really in contrast to the ventral stream. So we looked at some areas in the ventral stream. I'm showing you here the PPA, or parahippocampal place area, a known scene processing region. Here we have a bunch of the image models that are all performing at this level of the reliability of the data. Same thing with the video models, more or less. But kind of interestingly here, we see that the language models don't do a very good job, suggesting kind of a key difference with what I showed you before in the response to static images. So while the static image responses were equally well modeled by vision models taking in images or language models taking in their captions, here in the ventral stream, the caption information seems to convey less than what the video does itself. And I think this highlights the importance of testing these questions, even in the ventral stream, in more ecologically relevant contexts. Here you can see this in the ventral view of the whole brain responses as well, that the best language model is really in almost all regions lagging behind the best vision model. Okay, but the main thing I want to highlight here is that while we have a bunch of models in the ventral stream that are basically doing as well as you might expect relative to the noise ceiling, we have none of these in these high-level lateral stream regions. You can see a similar trend in the behavior, where if you look at their ability to predict the scene size, so whether it's like a close-up scene, like a small intimate setting office, or a large field or outdoor scene, all the models do really good at this. This is a pretty easy task for computer vision. But in contrast, if you look at things like these social primitives, whether people are nearby or facing, and certainly whether they're communicating with each other, none of the models do a good job at predicting this, particularly none of the vision models. And we thought this was pretty surprising. To highlight why, I'm going to return to the stimuli. So these are stimuli from a computer vision data set. They're very much in line with the types of stimuli that these action recognition models were trained on. The video models were trained on stimuli that looked almost just like this. So they're not special stimuli that we, as cognitive neuroscientists or psychologists, designed to trick the models. But nevertheless, most of the models can't tell us that the video on top contains two women nearby interacting and the video on the bottom does not. And so I think this highlights a really big gap in current AI systems, but it also raises an interesting theoretical question, which is that if I'm arguing that social interactions are recognized via visual computations, why are vision models so bad at this task? And it's not just this study that showed this. Lots of other studies have shown in different smaller, more controlled data sets that vision models do a poor job of reproducing human social interaction judgments. And this has led to the idea that it's lended support to the idea that humans actually don't solve these tasks via visual computations. They need something more akin to a world model or theory of mind, or to do some sort of mental state inference to solve these tasks. And this theory is often modeled with something known as a generative inverse planning model. So these have really been popularized by Josh Tenenbaum's lab. And the basics of how they work is they suggest that they take and suggest humans are doing something like this. When you view a video, I'm going to go back to the simpler scenario of the hill climbing example where one shape helps the other. What these generative inverse planning models do is they try to sample different hypotheses about agents and their goals. So maybe one hypothesis is that the blue circle wants to go up the hill and the red square wants to help. And another hypothesis is that the red square wants to hinder. And then for each of these hypotheses, they actually simulate what this would look like, and then compare the simulation with what was actually observed and do the best match to predict what was happening in the scene. And so both the hypothesis sampling and the simulation are based on a generative model of other agents in the physical world. And so this is a pretty different. One problem is that in most current settings, these are not tractable on natural videos because I don't have such a generative world model that works well to reproduce physics in the real world. But also theoretically, they're pretty different from this sort of purely bottom-up proposal I was suggesting, where you just take those information about those agents and through some series of hierarchical computations, you directly predict helping. And so these models are, the ones that work best in simple scenarios. These models don't. Even the more modern versions of these models don't work. But we wanted to see if we could revisit this question. Are visual computations enough to recognize social interactions? By imbuing these neural network models with more inductive biases. So an inductive bias is an assumption a model uses to learn and generalize. Oh, is this the right slide? Yeah. And generally, that it's thought that something like an inverse planning model that has very strong, it has a whole physics simulator as its set of priors, has very strong inductive biases, and most standard neural networks are thought to have only very minimal inductive biases. This distinction kind of maps onto the classic connectionist symbolic AI arguments that have been happening for decades. But it's not entirely true that neural networks don't have inductive biases. Things like convolutional neural networks do have some inductive biases, right? So a convolutional neural network inspired by visual cortex takes advantage of the structure of the visual world and natural image statistics. Even vision transformers, although again very weak, have some inductive biases that help them bootstrap their learning. But what we were really struck by was this kind of big gap in the middle between totally unstructured and structured. And we wanted to take advantage of new advances in neural networks to help us try to build more structure into these models. And in particular, we took advantage of a new class of neural network called a graph neural network. So if you go back to that hill climbing example, you could have two agents, the red square and the blue circle, and a standard neural network would take in some features about them, pass them through a series of hierarchical computations, and make a prediction. Instead, oh yeah, question. Oh, hi, Vlad. Yes. So we have tried that, and that does improve them. So they're already sort of fine-tuned. They get in the results I showed you, they get some very, it's like a final classification layer that is learned. So they do, even in that examples I showed you, get information about, in the training data set, how communicative people think they are. So there is some light fine-tuning, or one fine-tuned layer that gets stacked on top of them, even in the results I showed you. We've tried now to use some more advanced fine-tuning to improve the transformer models in particular. So one big problem is that we don't have much labeled data fully train or even do regular fine tuning on these big models. But there's a new technique called low rank adaptation for vision transformers. And so we've had some success fine tuning those on not the judgments themselves, but we also have some data where people view these videos and make similarity judgments of how similar they are. And so fine tuning on those human similarity judgments also improves their performance somewhat on these social tasks. So I certainly think that with enough data, these models could learn this thing. I think one problem is that for whatever reason, that's still not a focus of AI companies and computer vision researchers. But I think there's still a kind of a more interesting question of, in this low data regime, how can we take advantage of use inductive biases to learn more efficiently, which is what I'm going to talk about here too. But yeah. Okay. Okay, so instead of just treating these as two agents and putting their features into a network, we can treat them as two nodes in a graph. And we can also put in information about their edge and then learn information over those edges. And so this can be for a very simple graph with two agents and one edge, or a more complex graph with more agents and objects. And we can, again, put in that whole input graph to allow it to learn information about edges and make a prediction. This is called a graph neural network. We combined this with a recurrent neural network that takes into account new information at each time step to predict social interaction information, which we called this model social GNN. It was inspired by a growing body of work in graph neural networks, but has some differences to those other models that I'm happy to talk about later if people have questions. Okay, so to train the network, we started with this sort of pared down situation, but we took advantage of this really nice data set released by Josh Tenenbaum's lab, where they used a physics simulator to actually make hundreds of videos of these two little agents, each of which is programmed to have a physical or social goal. And so you can see that the two agents were in that. And then as a result, they end up looking either friendly, adversarial, or in some cases, they have two independent goals. So that was an example of a friendly video. What does this look like to people? Friendly? Yeah, adversarial. But there's some ambiguity, right? So some people had different thoughts. And then here's an example of a neutral video where they might be kind of incidentally bumping one another, but they are pretty clearly have independent physical goals. And so there's some ambiguity in these videos. So again, so the videos are all generated to have a ground truth, like what they are generated sometimes to have aligned or disaligned physical goals that can make them look friendly or adversarial or neutral. So we, again, collected human judgments and took the median of those judgments and used it as our ground truth to train the models. One sort of interesting thing is that although many of the videos were generated to look neutral, people often judge those as being friendly or adversarial, suggesting that we can't help but ascribe these kind of social intentions to these little agents. Okay, so for each frame of the video, we built our input graphs to our models. And so we treated the agents and objects as nodes. So in every video, there were two agents and two objects. And the input information was the position, velocity, in the case of the agents, the heading direction or angle, and the size of the agents. And then we built the graph by just the input graphs, by just saying if two agents are touching, put an edge between them. And this information was all released with the data set, but hopefully you agree that it could be extracted by a pretty simple visual system that just has to know how the shapes move in time. And we feed these graphs frame by frame into the graph neural network, or the RNN part of the neural network. So let me tell you a little bit about the details of that. So at every time step, the new input graph is fed into the video. And something a recurrent neural network that operates like an LSTM, if people are familiar with those, integrates information from past time steps with the current time step. And so at every time step, the new input frame information is fed into the memory from prior frames. And then at the final time step, we just train a linear classifier to say, was that friendly, neutral, or adversarial? And we compare this to some other models. The first was a control model where it has all the same input features. We try our best to match the parameter size. But instead of putting the information in as a graph, we put it in as a list of features. In some versions of this model, the features even include like our agents 1 and 2 touching and binary vectors for that information. And we, again, same linear classifiers trained at the final time step. We call this visual RNN. It's our main control model. And we also compared to the generative inverse planning model that the Tenenbaum Lab released with their dataset. OK, so like I said, humans agree with each other about, not perfectly, so it's about 85% human agreement. And what we see is that the control visual model is above chance, so it's a 3-way classification, but it's much worse than the inverse planning model, right? And so this is what they showed in the original paper, that this kind of purely visual model doesn't get the social intentions of these agents. But here what we see is that with a pretty simple tweak, our model, social GNN, our model can do quite a bit better. It still slightly lags behind the inverse planning model. But the advantage of the inverse planning model comes at a pretty huge computational cost, both in terms of REM time and memory. These models are very expensive to run, even on these very simple scenarios. And so this is more of like an engineering advantage, but I think it shows how these simple inductive biases can allow you to learn structure in kind of a more lightweight neural network that's easier to deploy at runtime. Further, if we look at not the classification accuracy of the models, but how well their pattern of responses matches the pattern of responses in the model, we see that both models actually have the same correlation if you do representational similarity analysis to humans as each other. Interestingly now, we can also do variance partitioning. So we can ask, are the models explaining overlapping variance in human judgment by taking their semi-partial correlation? And we see that actually they're both, even though they both predict human responses well, they seem to be capturing unique aspects of human responses. So some of this information is shared across the models, but it seems like a lot of the behavior can be uniquely explained by social GNN or the inverse planning model, suggesting that maybe humans use some combination of strategies that look like these two different computational models. But really one of the big advantages of moving into a neural network is that now it can operate on natural images or natural videos. So we took this gaze communication data set and structured a GNN in a very similar way. But here, the input features for the nodes are based on putting bounding boxes around people and putting those pixels through a standard vision neural network. So we do that for all of the objects and agents. And we build the input graph based on whether or not people are looking at each other. So in this one input frame, the woman in pink is looking at the man in blue, who's looking at the object in his hand. So that's what the input graph would look like. And when we do this, we can't, again, compare the inverse planning model to the, because it doesn't operate on natural videos, but we can take kind of a standard CNN that just takes that whole frame embedding in. That model can't predict whether or not people are interacting. The RNN model does a little better, presumably because it gets the information still structured in time, whereas this is a standard image-based CNN. But here we see, again, a pretty big boost of structuring the information in a graph. So in this case, in natural videos, we're still pretty far from human judgments because we really, this was mostly a proof of concept to show that this inductive bias would help with the learning. We're doing more work that I'll tell you about in a little bit to try to optimize these models based on some of the things that do work well in modern computer vision systems. Also, because the GNN is a neural model, we can compare it to neural responses. And so in ongoing work, Manasi is scanning people as they watch these cute little animated shave videos. and also collecting their behavioral judgments about whether they are viewing a friendly, neutral, or adversarial interaction. See that that behavior correlates with pretty large swaths of the cortex in these lateral regions. And social GNN aligns with their responses in very similar regions. So this work is still ongoing, but actually she's also figuring out ways to compare the inverse planning model to brain responses as well. And again, finding unique variants explained by both of these models in the brain. And so together what this work showed is that a vision model can recognize social interactions. It doesn't need to have explicit input information or a simulation of the agent's goals or the physical world, but it does need to have the right inductive bias. And in particular, we think this relational information is really important. And so together, I think this work suggests that recognizing other people's social interactions is kind of a core visual ability that is extracted via something like a visual hierarchy. But while most modern AI vision models fail at this task, a graph neural network that takes into account both dynamics and relations does a much better job at matching human judgments. And I think zooming out, this reliance on dynamic information and the relationship between entities is important not just for social scene judgments. I think that's somewhere it becomes immediately apparent, but I think it's really important for our ability to understand human visual intelligence more generally, right? So our vision is helps us extract all sorts of structured information about the world around us. And really, in order to understand what's going on, how the physical world interacts with the social world, we're going to need to move towards the types of questions that really get at these abilities. And I think that this is still really a place where human cognition and human neuroscience has something to contribute to AI systems. So just as one little teaser along this line, a very talented lab manager in my group, Wenshou Chin, has been taking this GNN model and comparing it to the AI vision models. And he found actually that, so this is the computer vision models I showed you before. These are all the image models, all the vision models. They can't really tell you if two people are facing or if two people are communicating. And again, this is just like taking that off-the-shelf GNN model. It can already do as well as like the best vision transformers on this task, right? So I think there's a lot of room for improvement, but I think building these very simple little inductive biases into these models can help us close some of this gap between and really provide insight into the things that are key for how humans solve this task. All right. So with that, I want to thank my lab, and I'm happy to take any questions. Mike.
Wonderful talk. I wanted to get your thoughts on how how dependent on vision the hierarchy is highlighted in the first part of the talk. And this isn't to the point that I think it's a well-made point. It's not people are seeing the vision and imagining something else, but if you were to use another modality,
Auditory,
would you see at least the STS region also showing?
So Cami Koldewin's group has done some nice work on this, where if you, for example, play conversations versus monologues, you see these STS regions prefer conversation to monologue. I think that the pathway to get there is probably different, but I think you're right that the STS, we know the STS is highly multimodal, and I think probably even the preference for social interaction is highly multimodal. And so I think in the most anterior regions, it's not, I would not call these like purely visual computations or regions or anything. And I think there's a lot of work still to be done in that area, but yeah. Johannes, oh yeah, go ahead. Oh, hi. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
You also see a lot of connections to the mind world. I guess a lot of connections to the language world, events, like but in the end, we need to have still different frameworks for theoretical vocabulary to talk about and define what we mean by social interactions. Things like facing one another that you mentioned early on as possible candidates don't seem to be necessarily the primary driver, but it might suit under something that is key social, right, per se. So I had a question about you're thinking about the theories that underlie these phenomena. And, the most promising sort of frameworks to understand what underlies social interaction and whether we can hope to achieve something like the precision of many of the vision models or even the language theories that help us understand, relevant phenomena, other, especially for all working towards this integrated
Yep.
underlies
All of it.
truly rich notion of interaction that we know.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I think that, and I maybe should have said this more clearly, I think this idea that visual social interaction recognition proceeds based on these sort of visual primitive spatiotemporal features is describing just a part of recognizing social interactions. And so how do we, but I think that dividing those subparts, and I think that is different than social interaction and language or event understanding. And so I think there's merit to understanding those individual problems, but of course the ultimate problem is understanding how they all interact. And I think that is really a challenge, but I think some of the analogies, like contingencies and turn taking, are ideas, and relations are ideas that transcend all of these. And I think thinking more precisely about how those all link together is going to be like a very important next step.
So I'm wondering about the visual hierarchy of features.
Yeah.
Potentially
Yeah.
this. And you characterized it as an abstraction, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what that abstraction might be grounded in. And think about like the ventral stream hierarchy, classic receptive fields get larger. Here, motion such a prominent feature.
Temporal
I'm wondering if there is a story about the temporal integration.
Yeah. I mean, so I think both the receptive field size gets larger, even across the STS, and the temporal integration windows get longer. I think thinking more precisely about them. So I think at that basic level, there's good evidence for that. I think thinking, again, more precisely about the mechanisms that subserve that is like a very important thing to do. But at least at that first glance, I think there's some suggestions of that, like you say.
I was going to think the more abstract, triangle, circle, moving thing.
Yeah.
Moment to moment, I'm not totally sure if it's adversarial or cross.
It's right. Yes. And I think this relates to Anna's question about events. Like your whole understanding of the event is very different than your understanding of each small snippet. We're doing some work to try to tease those two things apart so you can show people like different durations of the videos and see how they change as well. People's judgments do change over the course of the video. And I think that situation where you have so much less visual information is maybe different than the natural video case where your stimuli are richer. But yeah, I think the temporal integration of these things is it's an important question, but a tough one too. Yeah.
The edges in the second graph you showed us were directional because I can look at you.
Oh, yeah.
But in the first graph,
they were bidirectional. That's right. Yeah.
Because what building biases in is kind of not creating a bias in causation.
Yeah.
So I'm touching you because I touched you.
Mm-hmm.
Touching. So I was just curious about the choice of then as bidirectional.
Yeah. I think ultimately what we would like to do is integrate both of these cues. So you could imagine contact being directed, but it's a little more tricky. But in both cases, in both the natural video case and the animated shape case, they actually, even the animated shapes have a heading direction that's unidirectional. And the people are sometimes in contact with each other. So I think our ultimate goal is to think more about what more sophisticated versions of these edge cues that would have both of these types of components. But this was really just like the first crude pass we could think of. Anna.
So is your thinking that the STS is computing the relations and the segmentations that you're currently having your graph figure out, and your thoughts on how is that learned or how is that implemented, right? Because ultimately you'll want a neural implication of that process.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's kind of a nice analogy, and we designed it this way, between the features that go into the input edge and these things that we think these mid-level regions care about, like proximity and contact and heading direction and relative motion. And so I think the actual graph computation itself is something more akin to what's happening in the STS. There were two other questions. One was about the learning. I think that's really fascinating. There's some evidence that suggests that some of this is very present in very young babies, although it's, you know, it's going back and forth at the moment. But you could also imagine, yeah, so I think the learning is a really interesting question. Whether these are learned like through experience over development or like over evolution is something where, yeah, it's tough to answer, but yeah.
One thing I should just point out, because there's a basic crossover, is that Leyla Isik is speaking in the room at 12 o'clock on Monday. And so
Great.
it seems like this audience will also consider.
Yeah.
And so just in case you hadn't heard, he'll be here. And then if we could thank our.
Thank you all.